So as you guys know, I've begun the process of releasing a series of singles that are going to be compiled into an album, probably about spring 2023. And I'm really pleased with these songs. And this is the first time that I've worked with other instrumentalists, right? So I've been able to bring in a lot of other kind of textures and sonic voices that I wouldn't have until now. And so as these songs come out, I'll be taking a little bit of time to talk about both what went into the writing, but then also some of the things that are happening in the arrangement that I think are really cool. So lyrically, this song is about a particular habit that I have, and I think a lot of people do some version of this, right? A particular habit of romanticizing in memory periods of my life that were actually fairly miserable. There was one winter and spring in particular that I remember where I was having, two failed love affairs in parallel, watching both of those kind of decay and collapse. And my career as an academic was falling apart or really kind of, proving never to have existed. And I was living in Fairbanks, Alaska, which was often quite cold and dark and miserable, even during what was ostensibly spring. And, it felt at the time like I was having a lot of really sort of noble and meaningful experiences, even though, realistically, I was basically just a sexually frustrated drunk. And I still catch myself looking back on that period very fondly, even though in every way it was objectively worse than my life now. And I think that's a very strange tick. Now, nostalgia is probably always toxic to one degree or another. But it's especially toxic, I think, when it draws you back toward immiserating habits. And, it's just a tendency in myself that I find kind of ridiculous. And that's what the song is about. It's a very sarcastic song. It's a very ironic song. I'd even say it's rather mean-spirited, though the meanness is all inwardly directed. But it doesn't really sound like that. And I like that contrast. Now, as far as the chord progression on this song, this is really the first album that I've done where I've actually thought in terms of chord sequences as a writer. Up until now, I've always kind of built things more around melodies or rhythmic or sonic ideas, and the chords tend to be kind of built up after the fact or kind of implied by a melody that's based on an arpeggio. But this time around, I was trying to write as much as possible from guitar, just because I've never done that for this project, right? It seemed interesting to find kind of a new inlet to material. Basically, everything that I've done up until now has been written from piano or keyboard, because it seems like that kind of freed up a lot more compositional possibilities than guitar. But the thing about guitar is that chords are just kind of more interesting on that instrument, for whatever reason. At least to me, Maybe it's because you have this whole idea of a shape, right? Like every chord kind of feels differently in your hand. Every chord on a guitar just kind of feels like its own little person almost. It's a character. If anything, I almost think that writing from guitar sometimes leads people to write too simply because you sort of, you fall so much in love with the sound and feel of playing a particular chord that you don't necessarily think about putting as much on top of it as you should. But anyway, the opening chord in this is an E add 9, if I remember right, which is a very neat little chord. It's got a good mood to it, and it's just awkward enough that you're probably not going to find it by accident. It's a very sweet little chord. It's got a nice kind of atmosphere to it. I don't feel that drawn to major chords. A lot of the time I don't fall in love with a lot of major chords, but that's a very sweet little chord. Then you've got this little thing. I don't really know what that is. It's got a lot of E and B in it. It's got a lot of E and B, so it's almost an E power chord, but you've got that, you have that D sharp sitting kind of oddly, right? It's kind of odd to have the two notes, the E and the D sharp, that are just separated by a semitone in what's, like I said, almost a power chord. But, you have so much E and B that the drone from those disguises that dissonance a little bit. So it's just a tiny bit uncomfortable, and I like that. And you've got C major 7, one of those sort of ambiguous, evocative chords. Very easy to play. It's very common. Then an A7 that shifts to an A minor 7. So the verse progression ends on this kind of emotionally ambiguous note, right? And a lot of these are chords that are, they're kind of almost major or almost kind of neutral, but then they have this little kind of ambiguous element to them. I like that effect. Chorus kind of kicks in with this nice big D minor gut punch. In the recording, that shifts to electric, so it really kind of emphasizes that change. And then the last time through the chorus, there's a little interlude where you go back to the A7 and slide it up a fret. So this isn't the most creative or interesting chord progression in the world, right? Frankly, but there's just enough sauce in it, I think, with the 7s and the 9s, and that little touch of dissonance here and there that I'm not embarrassed by it, right? It's a nice chord sequence, and a lot of the arrangement is really just built on accenting that progression. So the beginning of the song, I have that same progression played on a synth, and then the guitar comes in. And then when you hit the second half of the verse, there's this nice little carpet of strings and brass just playing sustained notes that, once again, support that progression. I think probably, frankly, to most people's ears, there's not a huge difference necessarily between a synth string and something recorded live, particularly in a context like this where you're just doing those sustained notes. But I appreciate having that little bit of a more organic texture. So much of what I've done up until now has been very based on VST and plugin, and it's rewarding to have a little bit of that organic touch in the work now. And the bass on this track is played by Miguel Velázquez Matija, who's a really fantastic bassist. Tends to work a lot more in a jazz context, although he's very good in every style that I've heard him in. There's should be links to some of his other stuff in the description. This is a relatively simple arrangement, so, I wanted a bass line that would add a little bit of kind of narrative intrigue, right? Something that might kind of fill the gaps a little bit. So you've got his bass, it has this way of kind of sneaking in and out of all the little sort of holes in the arrangement, and I appreciate how it does that. Now in the second verse, this other layer comes in, which is an electric 12-string played by Jason Mendelson. And I love the effect that creates, this kind of wonderful shimmery guitar sound, paints everything sepia-toned, right? It puts a veil over the song that feels actually a lot like how nostalgia kind of distorts our vision of things. So thematically, it's very appropriate. Now, when Jason was doing the take, I actually had him play over the whole first half of the song originally, but in the final edit, I really just ended up using it for this one verse because, that sound has so much presence and so much character that it kind of owns whatever space it's put into. And its presence, really kind of transforms the second verse. I have this thing where I don't like repeating the same idea or the same piece of musical information without some kind of change or shift or addition, And having the addition of the electric 12 in this second verse is very transformative in a way that gives a little bit more of an internal lift to what could have kind of more been a structurally flat set of verse-chorus cycles. And then the end of the song, you have this shift to kind of an ominous arpeggio. Really was just sort of created by me trying to find the most awkward chords that I could still finger well enough to get a take of. And that reveals some of that kind of underlying darkness that up until now has been hidden more behind irony and nostalgia. And there's a pretty typical build up there with a piano solo. Nothing surprising, but I do think it's effective. In some ways, honestly, I probably might like this closing instrumental segment more than I like the first half of the song, frankly. And the piano solo culminates in this melody, which is doubled on viola for some emphasis. And then you go back to that A7 with the semitone slide, just to tie us back to the first half of the song. All right, so thanks for checking this video out. Thanks for your support for the song. If you want to hear the whole thing without my commentary, I'll try to put a link right about here. It's posted elsewhere on the channel. And I hope everybody has a good evening and a good week.